Labour Together is the group that catapulted Keir Starmer to Downing Street, yet after controversies, including spying on and smearing journalists, it's so discredited it's changed its name. Labour Together is now called Think Labour. Its former director, Josh Simons, also famously, as you'll know, resigned from government as a result of the scandal, and he's now resigned from Parliament. A new name, though, for the organisation and a lowly resignation will not clear the stink created by the Labour Together controversy. And a new article from the investigative blog Democracy for Sale has today uncovered new evidence showing that the highest parts of the Labour Party were implicated in the nefarious behaviour of the organisation. To quickly remind you of how we got here, Labour Together was set up by Morgan McSweeney to regain control of the Labour Party for the party's right, and they then failed to declare hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of donations. And after this was reported by the Sunday Times and by independent journalist Paul Holden, Labour Together hired private investigators to dig up dirt on the journalists in question. And this we already knew. It led to the resignation of Josh Simons, who sort of commissioned those private investigators to dig up dirt on those journalists. The Labour Party itself, though, has tried to distance itself from the scandal, sort of suggests this is something about this organisation, nothing to do with this party that we occupy. However, in documents obtained via a subject access request, Josh Simons can be seen to have emailed Paul Ovenden and Morgan McSweeney, then both working at Labour HQ, briefing them about the private investigators' findings. We'll read you this email here. So from Josh Simons to Paul Ovenden and to Morgan McSweeney. Hi, Tom Harper on copy will be delivering his report on Paul Holden on Monday. Could we find a time for Tom, Morgan, Paul and me to Zoom or meet in HQ sometime after that next week? Thanks so much, Josh. Well, I'm joined now by the subject of that email, Paul Holden. Paul, welcome back to the show. I suppose if you could briefly, before we get into sort of today's development, remind us again of the nature of the investigation that was commissioned into yourself and journalists at the Sunday Times by Labour Together.
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, for having me on again and to talk about the story, which never seems to go away. What happened very briefly is that in mid-2023, I went to the Sunday Times to have a program with a set of documents about these unreported donations, which seemed to point to the fact that there was a chance that Morgan McSweeney had deliberately chosen not to report them. And then when they were investigated by the Electoral Commission, they weren't candid in their responses. And of course, we now know that Keir Starmer benefited, at least indirectly, from these undeclared funds because they paid for polling and all sorts of work that then fed into his leadership election campaign. So it's quite a big story to begin with if you look at it. So basically, there is an undeclared pot of money that is responsible for making Keir Starmer leader of the Labour Party. And at that point, when the story is about to come out, the Prime Minister of the country, according to all polling. And pretty much within days of the story coming out in the Sunday Times and me doing some reporting with Matt Taibbi in the States, Labour Together appoints this firm called APCO Worldwide, which is a sort of a reputation management firm, PR firm, which helps big corporations dust bust difficult stories, basically. And what happens at that point is that APCO are, we've now seen the contract. I've now got a subject access request out of Labour Together, or now they're called Think Labour, which gives much more sort of granular detail about how this all unfolded. And we could see very clearly, very early on, that the first contract that's signed between Labour Together and APCO Worldwide, within a week of the articles coming out, says very explicitly, we will deliver a package of materials that will be used to proactively undermine my reporting and the reporting that I was doing with Matt Taibbi in the States. Of course, there's no mention in those documents of investigating a hack or anything like that. It's pretty plain. This is being seen as a PR issue, as like, this is damaging to our political project. This is a damaging story. We need to deal with it. And that's precisely what APCO sets out to do.
And at the time this email was sent, so from Josh Simons to Paul Ovenden and Morgan McSweeney, so back in 2024, I think they were both in HQ, weren't they? They then went on to become, so Morgan McSweeney became Chief of Staff to Starmer in Downing Street, and Paul Ovenden became, I think, Chief of Comms. Had there previously been a denial that they knew anything about this investigation into you? Does this sort of go against what they've previously publicly said, or does this just sort of confirm something you already suspected?
To be honest, I had no idea that Paul Ovenden had any connection to this whatsoever. I mean, it's quite ironic because one of the first big stories that I released from the book was about Paul Ovington and actually led to his resignation, because at the time he was director of strategy in Number 10. This was just right before Labour Party conference, and I'd had these internal Labour Party messages about him saying some pretty unpleasant things about Diane Abbott, which I gave to ITV. So it's kind of a bit of a shock to me that actually one of the people that I was effectively exposing with my book was involved in this. I had no idea whatsoever. I mean, Morgan McSweeney never gives a comment on the record. So we have so there's been no official denial from Morgan McSweeney. He's never quoted on the record about anything. The extent to which we've gotten some comment has been, if friends of Morgan McSweeney say he had no idea this was being commissioned or something like that. So we've never really had no denial. Now we have, this is absolutely rock solid proof. It's the first time I've known absolutely for certain. I've always suspected, I can never prove, I've always suspected it, but now we know absolutely for certain that Morgan McSweeney and Paul Ovington were copied into this. I should also point out there's a third name on that email that's been redacted. So there's a third person who received this email. I have no idea who they are. They're a person who was employed by the Labour Party, but that's been redacted. So I have no clue who this third person could be. But I think what, if I'm allowed to editorialize a bit, I think what it quite clearly shows, if you look at the context of the email and its wording, Josh Simons, when he writes to Morgan McSweeney and to Paul Ovington, he's not saying, "Hi, here's Tom Harper you've never met. This is the organization APCO. We've been doing an investigation into Paul Holden and other people." It's very plain from the email that they're discussing something they all know about already. And there is a plan to then meet to discuss the work they all know about. So at the very highest levels of the Labour Party, this is really a joint project. This is a joint project about how to respond to a damaging story. And we now know Democracy for Sale is confirmed with the Labour Party. So also this meeting that they plan here does actually happen. And then within days, I'm being reported to security services on the basis of really wild allegations. I mean, I should say that the report that APCO then delivers, I've now seen the content of the report pretty much for the first time ever through the subject access request. I'm not going to repeat the allegations in there. It's beyond what's been reported in the public domain. And they are absolutely probably the most defamatory allegations you could imagine being put about a journalist, that could have had such deep and profound, far-reaching impacts on active investigations and collaborations I was doing with law enforcement around the world. But if anybody had gotten a document, if the media organization had gotten a document and reported that straight, it would have ruined my life and my reputation. Absolutely. And it would have ruined the life and reputation of my colleagues and the small little nonprofit we run called Shadow Work Investigations, which does anti-corruption work. It would have absolutely, all the philanthropic funding we would have gotten would have dried up in a heartbeat. So it's not just that they were spying on us. It's not just that there was a campaign to look into us and find what was actually produced in the end. And there's more to be told again about how that's produced. But the thing that's actually produced in the end is this really genuinely despicable document that if it was ever published in any way would be ruinous to my life, my career, to all of my colleagues, my associates, all the people that we employ, a lot of people who just happen to know me, who happened to work at the same building as me, fell under the scope of this investigation. And it really is the absolute, that's the darkest of dark art stuff.